Okay, good morning, good day, and good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone attending to this ASEF side event, applying IRP methods and visualization into sustainable power planning. MC today, my name is Din Shao, and I am the Chief of UAE Mekong Safeguards, the lead organizer of this side event. The subject of this event touches on a personal passion that is utilizing punishment to improve upon conventional methods. In this case, we'll be talking about using satellite and visualized ground truth data to help governments and developers better plan their country's energy systems. The subject and the presenters we have for you today all play a part in USAID Mekong Safeguards, which is an $8.6 million 5-year program funded by the United States Agency for International Development. The goal is to reduce the negative environmental and social impacts caused by energy and transportation projects. We operate across Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, and China, working with governments, banks, developers, and communities to transition to sustainable infrastructure. Today's event is organized centers for our and Andrew session to ensure that we. That said, if you have any questions, please type them directly to get to during that session. So now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Amanda Vandendual, who is the Energy and Infrastructure Lead for USAID's Regional Development Mission here in Asia. Ms. Vandendual manages a diverse portfolio of regional energy and environmental safeguard programs and leads USAID's engagement with development partners. She's been noted for her work on USAID's Power Africa and represented the US government as Manfield Fellow in Japan after the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami. Amanda, over to you.
Thank you, Winston, and good evening to everyone from Bangkok. I want to first welcome you all to this ASEF side event, applying new integrated resources planning and data visualization into sustainable power planning in the Mekong subregion. The lower Mekong subregion represents one of the world's most rapidly developing economies. Its energy demand will double from 2010 levels within the next 14 years. Ensuring infrastructure is built sustainably, minimizing environmental and social impacts, and increasing climate change resilience is at the forefront of government agendas. USAID's Regional Development Mission for Asia, or RDMA, works with stakeholders of the lower Mekong to bridge this challenge of transitioning to sustainable infrastructure by helping integrate clean energy alternatives and environmental and social safeguards into power planning and infrastructure projects. It aims to strengthen ongoing initiatives in the region, including the US government's Asia Enhancing Development and Growth Through Energy, or Asia EDGE initiative, the Mekong-Australia Partnership, and the Mekong-US Partnership, working with governments, companies, and communities to contribute to a more secure, free, and open Indo-Pacific. The purpose of this side event this evening is to look at the new methods for analyzing and developing power development plans in a way that minimizes negative environmental and social impacts. In countries like Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, Myanmar, and Cambodia, national governments are deciding how to expand their power development plans. For the most part, these plans are generally prepared based on least cost electricity generation options over 10 to 15 years. This conventional approach usually does not factor in environmental and social costs. During this session, our presenters will explore several engaging methods that governments, utilities, and developers can use to better plan their power sectors. Jason Vici from the Stockholm Environment Institute will explain how international practices have improved integrated resource planning in avoiding over and underdevelopment of capital-intensive infrastructure projects and significantly avoiding negative environmental and social impacts of power projects. We're also happy to have partners from two USAID projects, USAID Mekong Safeguards and the USAID Severe Mekong project, as well as NASA, to demonstrate how primary source and satellite data can be visualized on open source platforms, giving planners a better perspective that can in turn make large-scale energy planning more inclusive. Finally, we will look at advanced energy scenario planning in Thailand and Vietnam, after which we'll open the floor to questions. With that, I'm happy to open today's side event. And we look forward to the knowledge our lineup of experts will provide, which we expect to be both timely and relevant, as well as visually compelling. Thank you and enjoy this session.
Okay, thank you very much, Amanda, and thanks for joining us tonight. Our first presenter is Jason Vici. Jason's a senior scientist at the Stockholm Environment Institute and the deputy director of SEI's modeling program. He focuses on energy modeling, policy analysis, and building, particularly in local transitions. Right now, he's also part of the USA Mekong Safeguards team, advising the Thai government on advanced power planning methods. Jason, over to you.
Thank you very much, Winston. And good evening to everybody. I'm very pleased to be taking part in this side event today and to be speaking to you about integrated resource planning in the region, and in particular, some innovations in Lao PDR. As Amanda very nicely framed, this is a region where there's tremendous growth, but also some very interesting developments in power planning strategies. So those of you who know the Greater Mekong subregion know that it's a region where there are evolving and intersecting challenges for power planning. Things that they're macro trends that are making power planning very difficult within the region. Rapid economic growth, for example, a move toward regional integration, including through the ASEAN Power Grid Initiative. Very quick technological change which countries all over the world are grappling with. The need to decarbonize and to protect the environment, and increasing pressures from environmental degradation, and an overarching need to realize the UN's Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2030 goals. And I think it's recognized throughout the region that there's an evolution in power planning that's needed. In fact, in ADB's study, ADB released a study last year on transforming power development planning in the Greater Mekong subregion, and they noted that really power planning in this area needs to evolve in three main ways, at least. The objectives for power planning need to be broadened. So we need to move beyond cost and consider environmental and social safeguards and goals. There's a need to examine the economic effects of power systems more holistically, as well as their cumulative impacts. And there's also a pressing need to integrate additional power planning options into the power development plans of the region, including considering variable renewable power, small scale distributed generation, new forms of energy storage, energy efficiency and demand side approaches, and enhanced interconnections and trading among countries in the region. And then finally, it's recognized that power planning processes in many countries in the region have historically not been paragons of stakeholder participation, and there's a need, and there would be benefits to including stakeholders from throughout society more broadly in the power planning process. If you step back and look at the developments in power planning throughout the region, I think there's been uneven progress, and ADB noted this in their analysis. And for example, in some countries such as Vietnam, there have been significant steps toward considering environmental, social, and other goals more comprehensively in the power planning process. But in other countries in the region, there's still some significant progress to be made. What I'd like to talk to you about today are some innovations in Lao PDR, moving in this direction of more comprehensive, more environmentally and socially aware, and more robust power sector planning. This work that I'll be speaking about is work that was conducted in partnership with the U.S. Agency for International Development's Clean Power Asia program, as well as with the Ministry of Energy and Mines in Laos and Électricité du Laos, the national electricity utility. And working together over the past couple of years, we've conducted a project on integrated resource and resilience planning. Before I dive into what we've done, I'd like to just give you a little bit of context about Lao PDR and the electricity system there, if you're not familiar with it. So in Lao PDR, the electricity system is of enormous national importance. And this is due in no small part to electricity exports, which have grown tremendously over the last decade, as you can see in the chart here. And at the same time, electricity demands for national consumption have been increasing. as the rate of household electrification has increased and demand for services such as air conditioning has increased. But interestingly, in Lao PDR, even though the country is a major exporter of electricity today, historically, imports have been relied upon to meet domestic needs. And this is in part because the system is dominated by hydroelectric power, and there's a need to import power during the dry season, but also because of the way the grid is configured in Lao PDR. There are, in effect, two different grids in the country, one for domestic consumption and one set of grids, really, that are directly connected to international trading partners for purposes of exports. And so even though the country produces a lot of electricity, it's not always available for domestic purposes. This sets the stage for some of the challenges that we were trying to address through this IRRP project. Now you might be thinking, why the extra R? In comparison to a traditional integrated resource planning project that a utility might undertake, IRRP seeks to add a couple of dimensions. One is to consider seriously a wide range of objectives, not just cost minimization and system reliability, but a number of other objectives as well. And in our work in Lao PDR, we considered air quality, climate change mitigation, affordability, various energy, security and independence goals, environmental protection goals, and other social goals, as well as trying to enhance revenues from electricity exports. The other way that the program differs is that we systematically explored a range of future uncertainties to try to develop insights about what robust planning strategies would be, given a very, very broad envelope of uncertainties, everything from technological development to the movement of population, climate change, the growth of the economy, and more. We undertook a long-term planning project, which really was looking at the impacts of the power system all the way through 2055. And we sought to integrate the national and export PDPs. We also made an innovation with respect to renewable power by looking at the development of renewable energy zones as a way of focusing development and driving down the costs of renewables development. And all of this was done in the framework of a capacity building program, where we worked with the partners within Lao PDR to develop their capabilities, technical and organizational, to conduct these types of analyses. Our program ran through 4 phases, which broadly speaking allowed us to convene the teams that were necessary, set the goals for the process, then systematically analyze electricity demands and supply in the future, and then conduct an integrated analysis, which looked for low regrets planning pathways given multiple future uncertainties. The platform that we used for this is a platform that my organization, SEI, has produced, consisting of 2 tools. One is the LEAP tool, the Low Emissions Analysis Platform, which is among the most widely used energy system modeling tools in the world. It provides a graphical user interface, demand modeling, and other capabilities for this exercise. And it was coupled in this exercise with a new tool that we've developed, a high-performance open-source energy system optimization tool called NEMO, which allows us to do optimization modeling of capacity expansion, dispatch, and power flow, and optimize the deployment of all of the components of the power system, including generation, storage, transmission, and the demand side measures. Another nice feature of that platform is that it provides a place where stakeholders can centralize their data and many different tools for communications of results to stakeholders. So it becomes a way of fostering dialogue around the power planning process. In terms of renewable energy zones, and this links to some of the other topics that will be discussed today, we conducted a GIS analysis using remote sensing and other data to identify the most promising areas for renewable energy development. What we looked to do was to pair up or to match areas that have high resource quality, but also low impacts in terms of social and environmental priorities, and would make the most sense to develop. After conducting an analysis of where in principle the most promising areas were, on the ground, we confirmed developer interests and then included the highest priority areas as options in our modeling analysis. I mentioned that one of the things that we did in this process, which I think really sets it apart and provides a good way forward on power planning in the region and elsewhere, is we did a systematic exploration of future uncertainties. So we looked at combinatorial uncertainties and hundreds of future scenarios and interactively with our partners explored the results in those scenarios and assessed the trade-offs to try to identify low regrets planning decisions. So those are decisions that do a good job of meeting multiple objectives, the multiple objectives that we laid out, considering the full range of future uncertainties. The idea is that it's probably not possible to find the best solution. We don't know enough about the far future to say exactly what's going to be the best, but we can find options and decisions that should do a good job of meeting our goals, even if the future doesn't turn out as we would expect if we made one or two projections. The outputs from our process are now informing the development of the PDP in Lao PDR. We came up with location-specific targets for deploying different components of the electricity system, generation, storage, capacity, new efficiency programs, recommendations for developing renewable energy zones as a way of clustering renewable development, driving down costs, and increasing the assurance for developers that transmission will be available. Climate change resilience actions, and the priorities, importantly, for monitoring progress and adapting the plan in the future. And I think this is just the point that I'll leave you with, that the future is very uncertain. The region is developing very quickly, but what's necessary are planning approaches that can allow governments and utilities and agencies to make just choices that should do a good job of meeting objectives under the uncertainties in the future, and that are also choices that don't paint the system and decision makers into a corner, choices that are amenable to adaptation in the future as conditions change and as priorities may evolve. And with that, I'm pleased to answer questions in the question and answer part of the discussion, and I'll turn the floor back over to Winston. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jason, for sharing SEI's informative experiences on integrated resource and resilience planning in Laos and other countries. Very insightful and sets a great context for the rest of the dialogue that we have for tonight. Our next speaker is Brian Eiler. Brian directs the Stimson Center's Southeast Asia program on energy, water, and sustainability program. He's an expert on transboundary issues in the Mekong region and specializes in China's economic cooperation with Southeast Asia. With USAID Mekong Safeguards, he's led the development of the Mekong Infrastructure Tracker tool, which he'll be speaking about tonight. Brian, over to you.
Winston, and it's a pleasure to be able to be here with everyone to talk about the Mekong Infrastructure Tracker Toolbox. And I hope that you can all see my screen. What we're going to do is, instead of going through a slide deck, I'm going to show you some online tools and do some demos of the things that you can do with the tools inside the Mekong Infrastructure Tracker online toolbox. And so what we're seeing here is the landing page for Mekong Infrastructure Tracker. And this is the key deliverable from the Stimson Center for the Mekong Safeguards project, or USAID Mekong Safeguards activity. And we're really grateful to our implementing Prime, the Asia Foundation, and funding from USAID to deliver this, this output to you. It's exciting, it's impactful, and it's bringing both transparency over infrastructure projects and impacts of infrastructure projects, and also ways that risks are presented to infrastructure development, as well as important levels of decision support to key stakeholders in the region. Now, what the Mekong Infrastructure Tracker is a toolbox, like I mentioned before, and our toolbox right now is about halfway full. We're looking to build out new tools and to interact with key stakeholders in the region to find better ways to build new tools and improve what we have, to again improve transparency around projects, impacts of projects, and decision support for key stakeholders. And what we've designed is again a toolbox that is both comprehensive and fits the needs of a wide range of users. So what you're going to see here appeals to policymakers, planners, academic researchers, the private sector, media, civil society groups, and others as well. Some of the tools are fine-tuned to appeal to narrow sets of stakeholders, and I'll show as we go through here. Right now, again, we have 4 tools on our infrastructure tracker website, and they are a dashboard, an impact screener, suitability mapper, and a deforestation app. And I'm going to go through each of these with very, very brief demos. So let's jump into the dashboard because it's a good place to start. My colleague Courtney Weatherby is going to be dropping links to what you see here into the chat group. What the dashboard is a place where you can learn a lot about the state of infrastructure development in the region. It is really an information starting point to gather information on individual infrastructure projects. That would be descriptive information. Let's say, obviously the location, as you can see here, marked by a location on the map. But importantly, participation. Who is the owner or the sponsor of a project? What banks or institutions are financing projects? And who are the EPC participants? That would be the engineering, procurement, and construction participants in a particular project. And you can also do things like turn on satellite views of projects and do filters to generate summary information. So what you see here is there are about 2,000 dots on this map, and this is the state of power generation in the region across a continuum of statuses from planned, under construction, to those that are operational. We're going to take a deep dive into this in a bit, but I also want to show you that we have, I can move this menu so I can use the top of my screen. We also have dashboards for 5 classifications of infrastructure: roads, rails, and waterways. So this is canals, national roads, railways, national road upgrades, urban rail, and importantly, high-speed rail, where again, you can get a zoom-in picture of the state of those projects and the development. This is a zoom in on our industrial spaces data set, where we have the polygons or the shapes of industrial zones and special economic zones and ports, seaports, airports, and train stations built out, as well as a transmission lines database. Again, clicking on one of these features will bring up descriptive information about that project. And I'll show you how to do that on our power generation tab very soon. And then finally, the reservoirs, where we've either incorporated existing data of the shapes of reservoirs, or we've gone in and drawn these on our own. So some of these shapes are really being seen for the first time, like the Lower Saison 2 reservoir shape. And you can download the information that's available on this dashboard and also download the GIS shape files if you're interested. Now, going back to our power generation dashboard, again, just to take a deep dive into a particular project, let's go to the Mekong Delta and take a look at some of the things you can see with this. So some of you know there's some wind projects in the Mekong Delta. If I click on this wind icon here, I should be able to bring up some information about that project. So here we can see when the project was completed, who the owner is. We don't have some information about this project, like the financier or the construction company. And this is a way, if you're a user, you can click the submit project data link here. If you know that information, you can submit it to us. We're going to verify it before we publish it. But this is a conversation that we're having with our user community to improve the data that we have here. You can also see the source of where the information comes from. And this process is repeated throughout the entirety of the nearly 10,000 projects that we have built into the database. So if we look, one other thing I want to show you here is you can turn on satellite imagery to take a look at these projects. And sure enough, if I zoom in on this Bacleo wind project, we're going to see the wind turbines. And again, you can do this for all of the projects that are across the 5 infrastructure data sets in our database. Now, also, what's really neat about the dashboard is that you can use it to ask summary questions or to conduct research and get key information about the state of something you're interested in for infrastructure development in the region. So for example, let's say I want to, first I could get a snapshot of total infrastructure development here using a charts button. And this will give me a breakdown of the number of projects that are operational, number of projects that are planned, number of projects that are under construction. And I can move through these charts to see who the main financiers of projects are. And then this is the country of registration of the organization or bank that is financing the project. We can get a look at kind of a power sector breakdown. And again, this is across all statuses. So if I wanted to kind of drill down to a little bit more focus here, I can pull up a filter chart and say, I'm only interested in the operational projects, and watch how this chart upgrades now. We're only showing the operational projects on the map, and the summary information now sums up what is displayed on the map. You might find it interesting that there are China projects here. We've also, because the Mekong Safeguards project seeks to improve information about environmental impacts around projects, we've included transboundary projects. So those projects that have transboundary impacts, that would be dams in China, also rails coming from China. So we're going into kind of the deeper connectivity of the region with our research. But those of you who know these power sectors well will see that these numbers line up pretty well with Thailand having about 55 gigawatts of installed capacity, Vietnam moving fast with over 60 gigawatts now of installed capacity. You could see some of that solar expansion that has happened in Vietnam over the past couple of years. And also what's really neat about this, another research question, where are the installed solar projects in Vietnam? I can take this chart and click on this bar and go deeper and just display those, and then cycle through this these descriptive charts to find out who's building them, or who the construction companies are, who the owners are. Here we find that Vietnam is the owner of most of the solar projects in Vietnam. So again, this is a great tool for asking questions, and we're finding that it's being used by media, by academics, by policymakers. We actually have a lot of outreach from the private sector, and interestingly, intelligence agencies who use our data to guide their own research and decision making. So that's a brief intro to our dashboard. It's kind of the marquee tool that we have developed. But now to show you the project impact screener. Again, this is the second tool in our toolbox. In a very brief run through, the project impact screener is a tool that brings all of the data, all the projects in our 5 infrastructure classifications together in one view. So what you're seeing is here, the power generation projects, the transmission lines, the roads, rails, and waterways, industrial spaces, and reservoirs, all in one view. And I have them turned on here. And this is great for kind of viewing the total connectivity. It's the only place you can do it on the Mekong Infrastructure Tracker dashboard. But importantly, what the project impact screener does is allow us to generate reports that interacts with other kinds of data. So here you can see a list of what we call environmental and other risk, environmental, social, and other risk layers, like armed conflict. I could turn this on. I'm going to see red dots pop up, and these are instances of armed conflict. Clicking on one of these will bring up descriptive information about that armed conflict. Here's one in Burma, and I believe this is data for the last 20 years. I can also bring up information on earthquakes. We know there's a perceived risk of seismicity impacts to infrastructure projects. So here, the bigger the circle, the larger the earthquake. And we can just squint at the data to see, how close some of these earthquakes are to infrastructure projects. I can also, this is going to get complicated, bring up key biodiversity areas. We're populating the map with more information. Sea level rise, we have a couple different choices for you. This is 2 meters sea level rise, which is probably unrealistic for our lifetime, but worth planning for, I think. lighting up the screen here. And I can use this to generate, right now, very basic environmental impact assessments, environmental social impact assessments. But as we improve the risk layers that are added into this, those assessments can get better and better. So how you do that is, here's an example. What I've done here is I've drawn an area of interest around the Luang Prabang dam site in Laos and created a buffer or an impact range of 100 kilometers around that dam. That's my own determination. If you're doing your own impact assessment, you can make draw the scope of impact according to whatever parameters you would like, and you can draw your own. If you're really interested in like 50 kilometers above the dam but 200 kilometers below, you can draw a shape to capture any information that you select in your assessment into one report. So what I've done here is I've turned on the protected area polygons. I've turned on IUCN Red List threatened species polygons. I've turned on key biodiversity areas and earthquakes. Obviously, I can do more here, as well as the other features in our data set, the infrastructure features. And I've run a report. And what we see is that there are 4 key biodiversity areas inside of that area of interest. There are 7 threatened species on IUCN's Red List. There were 2 major earthquakes from 2000 to now inside of that zone, and then 2 protected areas. And from here, I can download this information in a descriptive PDF report with a nice map to go along with it, and users can do what they want with that report. They can take it to their superior to say, here are impacts of this particular project. They could use it to write a report, write a media story, conduct academic research, and certainly these are those that I just described are the main users of this tool. So we're pretty excited to have this. And the project impact screener, again, is something that can be improved with more risk data as we move on, and also improve with additional data that's updated, infrastructure project data that's updated as we go. Now moving on to our third tool, this is a Suitability Mapper. And the Suitability Mapper is an interactive tool for finding suitable places, best fit places for infrastructure development based on parameters that you as the user define. Given the data in our databases and the layers that we have brought in, you can generate a heat map that glows red for places that are suitable and green for places that are not suitable, or define the colors the way you want. So we're just starting with a very basic map here. And what I want to do is, there are suitability mappers out there that show you ideal places for solar development, and but we can bring in other parameters as well. We can bring in parameters like, I want to find an ideal place for building out solar that does not have biodiversity impacts. So I can open up this menu here, and I should be able to pull up a chart that's seemingly not working. So I'm going to jump to a PowerPoint slide that helps with this. I think I might have had too much open in the back end, but we've got this prepared. So what I've done here is generate a suitability mapper that shows ideal places for high level of solar radiation, low areas of species richness, so low biodiversity impacts, an even level for slope, and population density and land cover. And the brighter or the redder the area on this map, the more ideal it is for solar power development. And again, this is a customizable tool where you set the parameters, you set the weights. If here species richness is more important to you, you can increase that to 40% or less, and set the own terms. So finally, I want to show you our Deforestation App, which is recently published. And the Deforestation App is essentially a calculator for calculating by year per infrastructure project how much forest loss happened with that infrastructure project. And so what I'm showing here is the Secaman 1 reservoir in Laos, and doing an analysis using the global deforestation data set out of the University of Maryland, which, if you can see here at the bottom, there's a table that displays the increasing forest loss as this reservoir is built and the dam is built out. And so 2012, 6 hectares of forest loss. But by 2014, that forest loss really picks up. And this is important data because for the first time, we're seeing the deforestation impacts year by year of infrastructure development. Now, this is kind of a looking backwards tool, but there are ways to bring in footprints of future infrastructure projects and imagine what the deforestation impacts of those projects would be. So that's a quick run through of our toolbox. Thanks for your interest, and I hope that you can use them. We're seeing tens of thousands of users using these tools to improve transparency and decision support for infrastructure development in the Mekong region. Happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Winston, you're on if you're trying to speak.
I think Winston might have had some connectivity issues. So if I can, I'm going to turn this over to Kun Piranan from Reservoirs Mekong to talk about satellite remote sensing support for decision support in the Mekong Basin. Piranan, over to you.
Thank you, Brian. And
sorry for my system for some reason froze. Okay, sorry about that. Let me jump right back in so I can give Piranan and Amanda a well-deserved introduction. Okay, but thank you very much, Brian, for demonstrating the tracker with us tonight, both visually compelling and informative. The tracker has garnered a lot of attention with the stakeholders we serve as one of several advanced analysis tools USAID has produced for analyzing infrastructure planning. Our next two speakers will expand on another visual set of tools and resources turning into satellite data actions on planning. They are Piranan Tawashirakorn, Chief of Party of Reservoirs Mekong, and Amanda Markert, who represents the U.S. National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA. While serving as party for Reservoirs Mekong, Piranan is also a director of the Geospatial Information Department at Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, ADPC. He's led several initiatives in South and Southeast Asia to quantify and map disasters and climate risks and make science information more accessible. His colleague Amanda works with regional organizations to help developing Earth observing satellite data and geospatial technologies to manage climate risks. He's also a research scientist and lecturer at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. Kun Piranan and Amanda, over to you.
thank you, Winston, and hope everyone can hear me well. Good evening to everyone in Asia and good morning to those in the US. I gotta say I have trouble turning on my camera at the moment. I'm not even sure if it's on, but hopefully it's on. What I would like to talk about in the next 20 minutes together with a colleague from NASA, Amanda Markert, is actually to continue on the theme that Brian had already started, and that is on the use of data and maps to help you guys to do better sustainable power planning. And this is done through the project of USAID RDMA called Reservoirs Mekong. So let me take a minute to introduce what Reservoirs Mekong is. To us, this is a very unique partnership between NASA and USAID. And it's a very important partnership because we felt that NASA bringing satellite data and technology that can help us address issues in the region, while USAID having the understanding of the context of the region and have great experience in applying science and technology into development projects. So we felt that this is a perfect marriage between the two big US government entities to come together and apply it in this lower Mekong region. The countries that we are working with include Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, PDR, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And another uniqueness of this project is that the way that USAID and NASA see this project is for sustainability. For us at ADPC, we aim to continue to serve the region utilizing the technology that's been developed under the project over the long run. So one thing is to not only to build capacity of the region, but also to look into sustaining the capacity in the region through the support of ADPC. And the main gist of this project is how we can bring satellite data and analytics to address issues on the ground, which I will be covering in a minute. But then the first question that you guys may ask is why satellite data? Because we know about the region. Some of us are from the region, from the country, so we know what's going on the ground already. But in addition to that, I can tell you that satellite can offer you something as an add-on that can supplement what you know on the ground. One best thing about satellite is that it is way high up in the sky, right? So it can see what's going on the ground over a big area. And the best thing about that is that it keeps repeating doing that, right? So it gives you an ability to see what happened today compared to what had happened yesterday or a year before. It gives you an ability to look at changes over time, right? And the other thing that people may not realize, when you think about having a satellite taking a video or picture of you from the sky, you may think that this is just about it. But there are many other sensors, many other capabilities a satellite can do. It can detect water, it can detect soil moisture, it can detect temperature, it can look at different soil land cover types. You can even look at the air pollutions, the quality of the air that you are breathing in at any locations. So there are a gazillion of applications that you can work on through satellite applications. And I'm just going to touch upon a few of them today. The first thing I would like to introduce here is an ability for us to use satellite data to indicate the level of flood risk at any locations. So let's imagine that you are a manager of a new energy infrastructure, right? You want to see if the location you want to build your infrastructure, whether or not that it has any threat from external threats such as flood or landslide. So the best way to do this is to really look back on what had happened in the past, right? This is the easiest way. But if you ask anyone in that area to rely on their memories on what had happened in terms of flooding in the past, I mean, people's memory can probably go back a few years. What if I say that I can go back 40 years and use satellite data to map exactly whether or not this particular area had been flooded and then had been flooded, how many times it had been flooded? That will give you an indication of what could happen in the future, whether or not this is the right place for you to build your infrastructure, whether or not you have to come up with a way to mitigate the risk. If you really have to build in that area, you should understand what is an underlying threat from flooding, and then have a protective measures to come into play even before flooding can happen and affect your infrastructure in the future. So this will give you a baseline on how you can plan your power infrastructure in the future. Once you build that infrastructure, you still want to keep monitoring what is happening in the area. So another ability from us that we develop is to give users an ability to look at flood extents on a near real-time basis, right? This will give you an ability to see whether or not your infrastructure is being flooded. And more importantly, what are the areas, surrounding areas that are also affected by flood, right? So it can give you not only the indication of damage to infrastructure, but also let you analyze the connectivity that you will need to connect your critical infrastructure with the other facilities. So this is another ability of the satellite that we are providing right now. So far, this has been applied for disaster management practitioners, but I think it can be easily applied to the energy sector. Similar to flood, right? Some of the areas in the region are prone to landslides, and we are developing another tool that look into how susceptible your areas are to landslides. What could be happening if you are building your infrastructure near a slope that someday could fall down because of heavy rainfall? So this map is an example of what you can see from the tool, right? The areas of dark red or dark yellow, dark orange are actually the areas that we deem as high risk from landslide, where the other areas that are has no color is the area that has no risk from landslide. So when you plan your infrastructure, this can come handy, and again, similar to flood, let you plan for the things that can happen to your infrastructure in the future. Recently, we developed another tool that give users an ability to monitor air quality. We thought that this can be useful for clean energy initiatives, because we think that air quality can be one of the indicators for you to quantify and measure success of your clean energy projects, right? You probably are used to seeing the air quality map that provide you spots, like locations of air quality measurements. What we did here is that we expand that and fill data gaps by using satellite data to fill data gaps. And what you can see here is that now you can understand and get the status of the air quality that you're breathing in at any locations in the Lower Mekong. So this is under development. We're pleased to say that this model has been calibrated with a lot of data from Thailand, but we are hopeful that we can get similar data from other countries so that this monitoring system can be even more accurate in the near future. Moving on to hydropower a little bit, I mean, similar to what Brian had presented, we are doing a tool called Reservoir Assessment Tool. This tool basically uses satellite data and a model, a computer model that mimics hydrological process from rainfall upstream into water flow into reservoirs, so that you can understand the amount of storage that a dam reservoir has in order for you to translate into potential for hydropower in the future. And again, this is an under development work, but we are hopeful that we can get this done and make it publicly available soon. Last but not the least, I want to touch upon one of the flagship tools of Severe Mekong, which is the regional land cover monitoring tool. So this relies on satellite data to map different land cover types, from forest to mangrove to urban areas to rice fields. This is important because it relies on over 20 years of data. So it again allows you to go back in time and do comparison of forest change or land cover change over time. And it is important also to say that this tool has already been calibrated and validated using ground data from the region. So we are pretty confident on the accuracy of this land cover and forest mapping tools that we have had. So these are just some of the examples from the existing tools, but I would like to invite Amanda from NASA to come in and talk about how we can leverage the knowledge from NASA as well as the knowledge from the other survey hubs across the globe. Amanda.
Thank you so much, Pirnan, and good evening, good morning, everyone. As Pirnan mentioned, I work at the NASA Science Coordination Office at NASA Marshall Space Flight Center. Next slide. So Severe works in countries all around the world. Our main focus is to build capacity of our partners and stakeholders to use satellite data and geospatial technologies to address complex challenges. We do this through capacity building, so training people how to use the data. Everything that we do is needs driven. So we conduct consultations with stakeholders to understand the need before we develop anything. Once we reach that point, we do work to help integrate leading science and technology to address the needs with our stakeholders and partners. Next slide. So Severe, again, is an initiative between USAID and NASA. We work through regional hub institutions like the Asian Disaster Preparedness all around the world. We also work with collaborators ranging from private sector, research institution, intergovernmental, and non-governmental organizations as well. Next. So Severe works across 5 hubs. In addition to Severe Mekong located in the lower Mekong River Basin, we also work in South Asia. We have 2 hubs in Africa and a final hub in South America. Next. So all of Severe's work is done so that it can be scaled and replicated across the network. We hold many exchange events where we pull together our hubs to share what they've been working on, the different services and technologies that they've been developed. So for example, Severe Mekong, several of their technologies have been either adapted by other countries, have been adapted by other Severe hubs, or even by groups like the UN Food and Agricultural Organization. So we really want to try and ensure the impact of the work we do and really hope that it's useful and applicable to other locations around the world. Next. We also work to integrate gender into our work through including women, through building women leaders and gender champions. We work to empower girls and women in STEM fields, integrate gender considerations into the services we build, and also use GIS and remote sensing to help address developmental issues. Next. So to take a step back, NASA maintains a fleet of Earth observing satellites. We send them up to space to look down at the Earth and monitor what's going on across Earth's many systems from the atmosphere to the bedrock. Next. So why are Earth observations useful for energy? Pirnan provided many examples of this. So energy faces challenges related to climate, looking at suitable areas for investment as well. And NASA Earth observations can help provide insight on energy infrastructure, identifying renewable energy resources, looking at weather and climate patterns, water, hydrology, land cover, and ecosystems. Next. So I just want to provide an example here of a case. Some researchers from Princeton use NASA data to assess how air pollution affects solar panels and solar energy in China. So we have an image here to the left that showcases areas in purple and cooler colors where basically there was air pollution, and on the ground there was decreased amount of energy released reaching the surface. On the right, I have a true color image showing all of the smog and the haze due to pollution. So much like how clouds can prevent solar energy from reaching solar panels, pollution has that same effect. So in addition to both having an effect on human health, air pollution can also affect renewable energy resources. Next. So Earth observations has many other applications relevant to energy, including monitoring and forecasting environmental threats, assessing impacts, greenhouse gas emissions, and many others. NASA has a project called Power that's working to pull together Earth observations directly relevant to the energy sector. And we currently have an ongoing training by our RSET program on using this data for energy management. Unfortunately, the training is almost complete, but the training is all pre-recorded and all materials and videos are provided if you want to follow this link and learn more. Next. So NASA recently announced we will be continuing our investment in developing a new set of Earth-focused missions called Earth System Observatory to provide additional key information to guide efforts related to climate hazards, forest fires, and agriculture, and just to demonstrate the importance of monitoring Earth as a system and the many applications of satellite data. Next. So I just want to conclude this presentation by sharing a picture from Severe's annual global exchange in Siem Reap, Cambodia. Early last year, this picture was taken just a few weeks before the world shut down due to COVID-19. This is just a small fraction of Severe's network. We work hand in hand with stakeholders in the region to build capacity to use satellite data and geospatial technology to truly bring space to village and address end user needs on the ground. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kunpiranan and Amanda, especially for introducing us to the time series data that satellite data can visually bring to us. It represents a compelling way to inform and motivate policymakers and key stakeholders to action. Our final speaker tonight is Courtney Weatherby. Courtney is a research analyst with the Stimson Center's Southeast Asia and Energy, Water, and Sustainability Programs and Deputy Director of the Southeast Asia Program. She's authored numerous technical and policy studies, including Thailand's energy development pathways, and will share those experiences with us today. Courtney, over to you.
Great, thank you, Winston. And so I am currently sharing my PowerPoint screen here, and I'm going to go ahead and really talk about how our team has applied some of the approaches that were talked about by earlier presenters like Jason, and utilize tools and data sets from the Mekong Infrastructure Tracker that my colleague Brian talked about earlier. So I think, all of us on this call are likely sort of familiar at this point with the intersections and interactions between energy project developments and other sectors, whether that's agriculture, climate, water management, or industry. So tools like the Mekong Infrastructure Tracker and others presented today, particularly those that utilize GIS and mapping, can really help make a multi-sector analytical approach accessible and relevant for non-technical experts, allowing people to map energy infrastructure projects against other types of infrastructure, key environmental indicators, and socioeconomic data. So these tools and these data sets can form a really integral part of the analytical toolkit that is used in technical and policy studies that are targeted towards very specific analysis. So I'm going to present today on really two separate studies which use a similar approach, which both take place in the Mekong Basin. So one of these is a completed study that is looking at energy development pathways in the 3S tributary system, which is a sub-portion of the Mekong River system. The second is looking at Thailand's electricity trade with Laos. And in the interest of time, I'm likely going to spend a little bit more time on the first study and then give a brief overview of the second, since the second study is still ongoing right now. So I think one base starting point that our team likes to approach regional plans and planning processes through is that when you look at all of the projects that are currently proposed or in some phase of development for the region, it's a huge amount of additional installed capacity. So while all of the Mekong countries are facing rising electricity demand, some countries face very rapidly rising electricity demand, hitting double digits annual growth on a yearly basis. There is obviously a need to expand power generation and also a pressure to expand regional electricity trade to help meet this demand. But at the same time, this map here, which is drawn from the Mekong Infrastructure Tracker and shows all of the projects that we have details on to geolocate on the map, actually builds out to significantly more capacity than is necessary or is planned for at the national level. So when you're looking at this map, it shouldn't be viewed as sort of a determined future with a series of projects that are marching along as part of a pipeline, but rather multiple futures, multiple combinations of projects which could move forward based on sort of policy decisions and investor decisions in each of the countries. When we're looking at this map, I think it's also important to consider, as Jason mentioned initially as well, sort of the multiple challenges with project approaches are made on an individual project. From the energy decision makers and policymakers, they're often considering primarily the key indicators, what's the fuel source, what's the location, what's the capacity factor, cost per kilowatt hour, and maybe capital investment upfront. But when we're trying to take a multi-sector approach and look at the intersections between energy development and other environment, social, economic, and political outcomes, it's important not just to look at projects on an individual basis, but also to look at sort of the broader system scale. This is particularly important when you consider the development of hydropower, which is a key currently, which is a key resource for all of the countries in the Mekong region, where that's additional hydropower projects under consideration. And this is vital because hydropower projects are built on a directly interconnected river system. So when you have impacts from a project that disrupt the flow of fish or sediment or other environmental resources, that can be compounded when you have cumulative impacts from other projects in the same cascade. So as we're looking at this map, I think there are many different pathways which can meet the regional energy needs, and there are opportunities, if you consider multiple scenarios of development, to strategically choose a pathway forward that can help optimize outcomes by limiting some of the negative impacts while still meeting regional energy needs. So the first case study that I want to talk about today is a completed study that was published last year, which is specifically looking at a geographically targeted area, the 3S River Basin, which is a transboundary river basin in its own right, shared between Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. It's a subportion of the Mekong Basin, and it's located near demand centers like Phnom Penh in Cambodia and Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. It's also got a wide range of different energy projects that are planned there to meet national needs in Cambodia and Vietnam, and Laos's previously mentioned target of exporting electricity to markets in neighboring countries. Most of the projects currently planned or under development in the 3S Basin are hydropower projects. There's already 50 operational dams within that sub-basin, and there's an additional almost 80 projects that are planned or under development in the future across all three of the countries. Now, why are we focusing on the 3S Basin? We're focusing on the 3S Basin because it's one of the last major free-flowing tributaries for the Mekong. There are already existing dams on the Sesan and Suipak rivers that sort of fragment connectivity and will impact sediment flow and fisheries. So the Sekong River, which flows from Vietnam through Laos and then into Cambodia where it joins the Mekong, is the last major free-flowing tributary downstream. So it's critically important for fisheries in Cambodia and linkages to the Tonle Sap, which is the most productive freshwater fishery in the world. And it also contributes greatly to aquaculture and agriculture in the Mekong Delta by providing sediment flow and nutrient-rich resources. Development in the 3S Basin to date has been somewhat limited due to a lack of supporting infrastructure, particularly on the Lao and Cambodian sides, but this is changing due to the pressures to expand capacity and also to improve and expand on regional power trade. So it's expected to increase through the 2020s. So our team essentially marries the existing and up-to-date data set from the Mekong Infrastructure Tracker of all of the proposed projects and projects that are already operational and under development in the 3S Basin with planning documents and approaches in each of the three countries, as well as sort of power sector trends that we're starting to see through the region to identify 4 potential scenarios for development. So this is not comprehensive. These scenarios are really meant to be illustrative of different pathways which could proceed based on the decisions made at the national planning level, but they are all politically, economically, and technically feasible based on the resources that are currently available. So the first scenario that we explored is essentially a full build-out scenario. So this map shows all of the proposed projects where we have sufficient data to geolocate them. So for hydropower, that's all of the projects in the basin. For solar projects, that's really only the projects that have been already proposed and sort of documented. But this scenario would essentially anticipate that most of the national planning agencies and investors prioritize existing project proposals over potential new technologies or new proposals for additional solar, wind, or hydropower projects. It also anticipates that the national planning processes remain relatively independent. So at the moment, countries in the basin, despite sharing the basin and recognizing the transboundary nature of the 3S basin, are largely building projects and developing their national energy plans independent of one another. So Vietnam is looking at potential projects to invest in and purchase power from to meet national demand. Cambodia is largely doing the same thing, and Laos is building projects out for export to neighbors. There's a relatively limited coordination under this scenario. The second scenario would be a coal-heavy build-out for the 3S basin. So this scenario essentially builds on some policy trends that we've seen in recent years, particularly in Cambodia and Vietnam, where in Cambodia, we've seen a number of comments sort of raising questions about the reliability of hydropower. As many of you on the call know, there's been major droughts affecting Southeast Asia and the Mekong Basin in particular in recent years, particularly 2019 and 2020. And during that time frame, Cambodia suffered rolling blackouts in Phnom Penh for multiple months because hydropower reservoirs simply are not able to provide sufficient water to produce power to the expected capacity. So there's been a push inside Cambodia to diversify away from overdependence on hydropower and build out alternative energy options. So this scenario essentially builds on that trend, anticipating that Cambodia decides not to move forward with additional domestic hydropower in the 3S basin and instead invests in alternative projects, including imports of coal electricity from Laos, which was an MOU that was signed between Laos and Cambodia over the last 2 years to build out coal projects, mostly in Mekong province, which is within the 3S basin, and export that electricity to Cambodia. This scenario also anticipates that Vietnam will likely move forward in continuing to purchase electricity from Laos, but that it may not purchase primarily hydroelectricity. So there are a range of projects that are under consideration for power imports from Laos to Vietnam, and those include some coal projects. And there's also been sort of rising pressure inside Vietnam to move away from projects that impact the Mekong Delta. So this scenario expects sort of a heavier build out of coal and limited build out of hydropower, specifically only hydropower projects that would have limited impact on connectivity and therefore limited impact on the Mekong Delta. The third scenario that we considered is really a renewable energy build out scenario. So as I think all of us are familiar, there's been this boom in renewable energy investment in recent years, particularly solar in Vietnam, where Vietnam added something like 9 gigawatts of solar to the grid in 2020 alone. So this scenario anticipates that these trends we've seen playing out around the region, driving investment slowly towards alternative renewable energy technologies like solar and wind, does play out in the 3S basin. But it anticipates that this is done not in sort of a strategic shift away from building out hydropower, but rather on a case-by-case basis as individual projects are able to compete economically with alternatives, and therefore investment flows towards those projects, power purchase agreements are signed towards those projects, but there's not necessarily a strategic approach to development of renewable energy. And within that context, it also anticipates that there's not a strategic approach to remove impactful hydropower projects that would break connectivity from the power plant. So it's very possible under such a scenario that we would see a significant progress on renewable energy deployments in these three countries, but that we could still see one or two hydropower projects built on, for instance, the mainstream of the Mekong River, because those projects tend to be larger in capacity and might be more attractive for signing power purchase agreements and receiving investment. Finally, our fourth scenario is essentially the concept of a clean energy zone. I think this is a little bit broader in terms of concept than what Jason mentioned earlier, but it's essentially looking specifically at the 3S basin as a zone where there is a wide range of potential projects which could receive investment, including solar, wind, and hydropower. And this scenario anticipates, unlike the other three, that there is strategic coordination between all three countries, looking at sort of the pressures to improve and expand power trade in the region, looking at the pressures to expand carbon-friendly renewable energy investments, and looking at growing concern this scenario anticipates that there's negotiation between the countries to identify the most impactful hydropower projects and remove those from the map, instead substituting investment in a mix of renewable energy like solar and wind, as well as hydropower projects that are strategically sited upstream of existing hydropower projects. So there's no net loss to connectivity. And just to put this into perspective, in addition to thousands of megawatts of solar capacity and wind capacity in the region, there are approximately 2,700 megawatts of hydropower projects which could be built upstream of existing hydropower projects and therefore would have limited connectivity impacts. So when we modeled out these scenarios, there were a range of different considerations that we could take into account, looking at sort of the number of projects, looking at the overall installed power generation capacity. I'm really just going to focus in here on the connectivity losses, because that really is where we can see sort of the linkages between the renewable energy transition and power planning processes and environmental impacts to local communities along the river. So under these scenarios, depending on exactly which projects move forward, the only scenario which would maintain a status quo or close to status quo for connectivity in the region would be a strategically coordinated clean energy zone or a strategically coordinated approach to the region. Otherwise, the coal-heavy scenario is likely to still see an additional 26% loss of connectivity between the Mekong mainstream and therefore the Tonle Sap fisheries and Mekong Delta agriculture and the 3S tributary system, and either a full build-out or a renewable energy transition could still see up to 40% or 43% loss of reduction in connectivity due to sort of the lack of cohesive coordination on which projects move forward. So while all of these energy pathways are potentially feasible for the region, they have significantly different impacts. So this approach is one that this sort of scenario-driven approach is one that we've piloted in the 3S Basin and had a lot of useful feedback on. We've also done a study which is ongoing that takes a similar scenario-based approach that marries sort of technical modeling, existing data sets with knowledge of regional power sector trends and planning processes to look at Thailand's power imports from Laos. So this is really a study that's ongoing. It has sort of two phases, one of which was a study that was published in 2020, and the second phase of which is an ongoing study to sort of expand on that and build more nuanced scenarios, but essentially looks at Thailand's involvement as an investor in and purchaser of electricity from Lao PDR. So as Jason mentioned earlier, Laos is building out most of its power generation for the goal of exporting power to neighboring markets. Some of that's going to Cambodia and Vietnam, but Thailand is by far the largest off-taker at the moment for Laos, and they have an MOU to expand their power purchases to up to 9,000 megawatts of power over the next decade and a half, up from about 5,500 megawatts of power that Thailand's already signed power purchase agreements for right now. Thai companies are heavily involved in the Lao power sector, and Thailand's power purchase agreements often act as sort of a revenue guarantee for projects that allow developers to go get financing. The decision to make sense of power are really influential and can often be a determining factor for whether or not those projects in Laos move ahead. So this study that is ongoing sort of had a phase one in 2019 and 2020, which considered three separate scenarios with different amounts of imported power, essentially a high power import scenario that was more in line with long-term anticipated imports of electricity. Second scenario, which is true to the current power development plan 2018 in Thailand, and a third scenario which reduced power imports in favor of domestic renewable energy. So this study was published previously. I'm happy to drop the link into the chat. Included a range of modeling indicators across sort of energy mix and energy security considerations, as well as connectivity, sediment flow, and other geospatial impacts like land inundated by reservoirs, people that might have to be relocated, and other social and environmental considerations. And we received a lot of significant interest from policymakers and others in Thailand in this approach, in this sort of scenario-based approach, similar to what Jason mentioned in the IRP study that they'd done in Laos. But one of the key feedbacks that we received is that it would be really useful for the second phase of the study to explore more nuanced scenarios where instead of looking at changing amounts of power imports, we sort of set the goal of meeting Thailand's existing commitment to import electricity from Laos and explore different portfolios of projects that would meet Thailand's overarching needs and sort of MOU to import 9,000 megawatts, but which could have very different power mixes. We also, over the last year, obviously have seen a lot of power market shifts in terms of higher integration of new technologies like rooftop solar and distributed generation, battery storage, electric vehicles. Thailand now has a significant amount of excess electricity in the system. There are growing pushes for carbon neutrality, and then COVID-19 has impacted energy markets and project portfolios and pipelines. So we're in the midst right now of doing an ongoing study that basically takes into account all of these shocks, all of these power sector trends to really build out more nuanced baseline assumptions for the scenarios under this next study. And we really anticipate, based on the feedback that we've received so far, that this approach is quite useful for policymakers and other stakeholders in Thailand who are looking at Thailand's energy future and the alternative pathways that Thailand has on the table for meeting that energy future. So with that said, I'm going to stop here. I think I'm a little bit over time and I want to make sure we get to the Q&A session. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hopefully we can open up to the Q&A with all of you.
Okay, thank you, Courtney. That was great coverage of current developments in the 3S Basin and the region and the different scenarios and the energy transition you can see playing out. Near the end over there, I'm glad you got a chance to take a breath. So sorry for rushing you off a little bit, but that was very, very informative. I want to join the audience now in thanking all our speakers for your enlightening presentations, and let's move over to the Q&A session for today's side event. A reminder to the audience, please let us know what questions you have in the side box and preferably to which speaker your question relates to. Our first question over here comes from Anant to Jason. What was the end result of the IRRP? What was the least regret strategy for Laos over the next 10 years? And has it been incorporated into the Laos official planning?
Very much for that question. So the IRP process really produced a lot of very detailed results, and there's not really enough time to go into each one specifically, but I'll outline in broad terms some of the major findings of the analysis and then how they've been connected to the PDP process and Lao PDR. So one of the things that we found was that a future where the government and developers are investing in a diversity of power generation technologies is going to be a more robust outcome for Lao PDR. We considered a few different overall development pathways and looked for robust solutions within each of those. One was a more hydropower dependent pathway. One was a pathway premised more on coal development. One allowed technologies to compete and have technological diversity. And that final pathway did prove to be most advantageous in terms of all of the goals that they were interested in, everything from power sector resilience to the reliability of the system, revenues and impacts on the environment and other social endpoints. So that was one major finding. Another major finding was that in terms of variable renewable power, solar power is probably the most attractive option for development within Lao PDR. And that includes solar power both within new renewable energy zones, which would be zones that are not currently connected to the transmission grid, but where co-development of transmission and the generation resources would be advantageous, but also solar power elsewhere in areas that are already connected well to the national grid, in urban areas in particular. Solar power is potentially very compelling. Also, potentially floating solar on hydropower reservoirs, as is already being piloted elsewhere in the region, is an attractive option. Another major finding that we had was that from the standpoint of the resilience of the power system, and in particular resilience to climate change and extreme weather due to climate change, enhancing power system standards, monitoring and enforcement is a crucial step to driving down costs and improving system reliability. And then I would also say that we found that better connections between the national grid and international trading partners are really quite significantly beneficial for Lao PDR. Right now, there is at times surplus generation on the national grid, which can't effectively be traded with international partners who would most want to have it. And so improving those connections, I think, is another outcome that the government should be focused on. And I know there are synchronization challenges between the Lao grid and other partners' grids, but finding ways to overcome those and to increase the ability to export power from the national grid, and in particular from installations that the national utility controls, would be an advantageous outcome. So those are some of the things that we found. And there are, within each of those categories, the recommendations get quite specific in terms of how much capacity should be deployed, where it should be deployed, what the timing of it should be. But in broad strokes, those are some of the major findings. And those results have been, they're being taken on board in the PDP process right now. The PDP process is ongoing in Lao PDR. They have worked on and are working on both shorter term and longer term PDPs, and various findings from our work are being incorporated in those processes.
Great, thank you. I'm going to mix some of these questions up, make sure we get good diversity from the panel. Next question from Anant is how it looks like it's for the Server Mekong team, Piranan and Amanda. This is coming to you. How are the impacts of the investments tracked? Impacts on air pollution or water resources, etc. In general, we may need to get to forecasts in addition to existing infrastructure. Is that possible?
Amanda, you want to address that first, and I can fill in.
There's different ways to track impacts. As Piranan demonstrated, there's a long legacy in years and sometimes decades worth of Earth observation. So if we look over a single area, we can track changes in, let's say, air pollution over a decade and see if there's any trends and changes, to see if maybe intervention and policy changes could have an effect on overall reduction of something like air quality, deforestation, and many different applications. The data that we work with at Severe, one component is the satellite data that is providing monitoring, sometimes daily, sometimes multiple times a day, of what's going on. We also do produce forecast products. So for example, with the air quality tool that Piranan showed, part of that tool is generating air quality forecast into the future, and there's several other of those products available to help address those types of forecasted events as well. So Piranan, would you like to add anything as well?
Yeah, just a little bit, Amanda. That was a great summary. The other thing that I want to add here is that when you want to quantify the impact, you also wanted to know where the infrastructures are and how vulnerable those infrastructures are to the external threat that we are talking about, right? So we are developing another application that look into just that. So we are quantifying the vulnerability through using AI and scouring through social media such as Facebook and other information that can give us an indication of the level of vulnerability to the infrastructure as well as the people who live in those infrastructures. And combined with the forecast of the threat, such as the flood, landslide, or air quality, we can estimate the impact on infrastructures and people.
Okay, great, thank you. So this next question comes from Kunmeti Wan. Question back to Jason. Did you only consider renewable energy zones as the only RE supply in the model? If so, does that mean that if Laos would like to allow RE investments, it would be in renewable energy zones only?
Thanks for that question. The short answer to that question is no. And as I alluded to this in my prior response, so when I say a renewable energy zone, what I really mean is an area that doesn't have good transmission connectivity at present, but where there is a good prima facie case for building renewable generation because the resource quality is high and because it also is a good place to invest from the perspective of other social and environmental goals. And so we identified a number of these types of potential renewable energy zones within Lao PDR in our IRP work. We also identified other areas in the country where there is a good transmission connectivity at present, but also good renewable resources, and the areas where are attractive generally for renewable power investment. And we included both of those types of generation options within our modeling. And what we found was that it makes sense to invest. In many cases, it makes sense to invest in areas where there is already transmission capacity, but also in some cases, it made sense to develop new renewable energy zones and co-develop the transmission and the generation capacity. And by doing that, by providing an assurance that the transmission capacity will be developed, you can provide better incentives and a better investment environment for developers, and thereby incentivize the development of the cost-effective renewable power. So we did consider both types of investment opportunities in the modeling and found that both made sense in some contexts.
Great. So Meituan also had a question for Courtney Weatherby. How did you come up with the assumptions for each scenario in your 3S basin analysis? Are they based on government's interest?
So I'm happy to answer that briefly. And I think, Meituan, if you're interested in sort of the full details, then check out the study link that I dropped into the chat, because you'll see sort of the full list of assumptions for each of the scenarios there. But generally speaking, yes, they were each based on sort of policy statements, national planning documents, and then existing, public comments from officials in each of the countries, as well as broad power sector trends that we've sort of observed in recent years within sort of the renewable energy sector. So for instance, for the second scenario, the coal heavy scenario, that is deliberately and explicitly drawing on statements from Cambodia about the need to diversify away from hydropower and the MOU that had been signed for buying power from coal projects. With the renewable energy scenario, we were looking at sort of national policy statements from Vietnam and Cambodia about sort of the need and interest to expand on renewable generation. Generally speaking, most of these comments were not explicitly directed at the 3S basin, but we did sort of base these scenarios based on broader implications for what national planners were thinking about for the national mix. And I think for Vietnam in particular, the study is very timely because they're working right now on their Power Development Plan 8. And they're further along in the development process than they were last year when the study came out in early 2020. But they are explicitly sort of writing in considerations of which projects they do want to purchase from in Laos, in which they are concerned about because of impacts downstream within the Mekong River system. So I think that, while this study is not only intended for policymakers, so it was intended for a general audience and therefore did account for some trends that were not explicitly stated in policymaker statements or national plans, that it is sort of a timely study that can help inform those rethinks or updated policy planning decisions that are being made.
Great. So we've heard questions from Meituan and Anant, and we have Martin Price, who asks, I believe this is directed towards our Mekong, Survey of Mekong and NASA folks on the line. Can these data visualization tools be used for urban spaces to look at the viability of enhancing energy access and informal settlements, or enhancing capacity through decentralized solutions to meet excess demand? Martin asks.
Maybe I'll start first and I'll let Amanda fill in. Yes, possible. Right now, we have not gone in through that level of details to look into cities and urban areas. Our application so far had been focusing on the entire lower Mekong region. But the same kind or similar kind of technology can be made applicable, especially when we bring on high resolution satellite data to look into cities and what happened in the city, the threat that may be posing to the cities. Amanda, you want to add a little bit about the availability of high resolution data?
So some of the data NASA offers has variable resolution that will get down into more detail to look in urban areas. We also work sometimes with private companies that have very high resolution data to really look down at urban levels and look at these things. But I'd also like to kind of pass this question over to our colleagues at Stimson Center, who are also doing work on infrastructure and data visualization, to see if they would like to add to this as well.
Thanks, Amanda. To talk about resolution, I think by and large, we all use publicly available inputs for optical imagery. So for the most part, that restricts us to something like 10-meter resolution at best. But that's not to say things won't get better. As time moves on, public access to optical imagery will increase, as well as to radar imagery and other forms of remote sensing data. And so, this is going to improve over time. I think Surveyor, since it's been around for almost a decade now, we can track, how the resolution of various imagery has improved over time, and kind of think into the future how it will get better. I think a goal of tools that are built by U.S. government-sponsored projects should be to use publicly available inputs. There are lots of proprietary imagery libraries out there that are very costly, and if we are going to use that higher resolution imagery, we wouldn't want to pass the cost off to the user. And keep our products light and cost effective. And so 10-meter resolution, pretty good for now. There's better stuff out there, but we'll watch as imagery resolution progresses.
Great, and this is an exciting exchange. Unfortunately, we only have time for about 2 more questions, so I'll move quickly over to the next one. Jason, this is for you. Anant asks, how was Vietnam's demand and build out in Vietnam modeled in the Laos IRP? Also, which key metric allowed the diverse technology scenario to be considered as most robust? Cost?
Great, thanks for those follow-up questions, Anant. So just very briefly, we started as a way of understanding what the potential exports could be. We started by looking at current power purchase agreements, and then according to the Lao government, potential power purchase agreements between Lao PDR and Vietnam. But then what we did is we used that as kind of a baseline scenario, and then looked at pretty wide variation in potential electricity exports around that. Electricity variation that would basically range all the way from Lao PDR almost stopping the development of new large hydropower projects for export to up to their developing almost all of the available large hydropower potential for export to Vietnam and other countries. So the answer to your question is we didn't just consider one demand scenario from Vietnam, but a very broad envelope of demand possibilities for Vietnam. And then as for which metrics or metric allowed the diverse technology scenario to be selected, in that case, it wasn't a single metric. It was the combination, an analysis of all of the different 10 or 12 planning goals that we had for the process that allowed us to determine that scenario was going to be the most advantageous. So those included they included costs, but also revenues from exports, protection of aquatic ecosystems, reduced relocation of citizens, air quality and climate change mitigation, affordability of electricity, energy independence and energy security for Lao PDR for its electricity system, and other goals as well. So we conducted an analysis really where we tried to balance the attainment of all of these goals in view of the uncertainties, including in the case of Vietnam, the amount of power that might be exported to Vietnam.
Okay, great. And for this last question, turn it over to Piranan and Amanda. Anant asks, for the Surveyor program, are you looking into forecasting floods given the changes in meteorology and extreme weather in the Mekong area? 40-year history may not be a good predictor for the next 40 or even 10 years.
Thank you, Anand. This is a very good question. I'll go first and I'll hand it over to Amanda, whose specialty is on meteorology. Yes, the short answer is yes, we are looking into flood forecasting in addition to looking at the past and the present, but we are looking in the future. And we are looking at floods from actually 2 very different time span. Over the long term, we're talking about 10 years, 40 years, 50 years. We are studying the impact of climate change on potentially how a severe flood could become in the future. Over the short term, because we're talking about 5 to 10 days ahead, so that people can prepare for the incoming flood. Yes, we are working with the Mekong River Commission to improve that data inputs, to bring on new satellite data for rainfall, to improve the accuracy and even lead time of the flood forecasting. At the same time, we are expanding that work in cooperation with the Siem network globally to bring a global model and try to, now it's being tested in another region, but we are envisioning that that will be replicated in the Mekong region for flood forecasting. Amanda, did I miss anything?
No, I don't think so. I think you covered it all. And I just wanted to add that, we do leverage forecasts that, generate forecast forward-looking, week, sometimes a month, 3 months, and then also leverage climate models to help assess different types of potential impacts on flooding and to support scenario analysis. So again, we're working with stakeholders. One example is this work with Mekong River Commission, where we're, part of that work is plugging in this forecast data to support improving their flood forecast, working hand in hand with them, but also partnering with some of these other organizations that are creating global flood and stream flow forecasts to make that available, especially in areas where it may be data sparse and there may not be, for example, a stream gauge providing observations. So trying to fill those gaps and look forward to the future.
Okay, thanks for that. And with that, we come to the end of today's side event, but everyone, I'm talking to the audience, please stay for a moment as we hand this back over to Mark, who will speak with you about how to download some of the resources you've seen here today. Before we do that, I just want to thank Mark Dunn and his excellent team at Tetra Tech who has supported this platform today, and thank USAID and our partner organizers, Stimson Center, Survey Mekong, NASA, and Stockholm Environment Institute for contributing your time and providing us with the insights, truly awareness-raising insights you've done so with today. So just want to also remind everyone that once you leave the room, you'll see an automatic survey. We implore you to please fill that out, as your feedback is crucial. Mark, back to you.
Great, thanks, Winston, and thanks to all the panelists and attendees for joining today. You'll see there's a pop-up box that's going to appear on your screen right now. This will give you the ability to download the presentations as well as some additional materials. There will be 2 files that'll pop up here shortly. Just click on the names and then click on download just above them, and you'll be able to download those files and access them. And if I may echo Winston's request to complete the post-event survey, that would be very helpful. So again, thank you very much for your attendance, and we look forward to a great rest of the ASEF week. Thank you.